Hey everyone, we'll give folks another minute before getting started. Okay, why don't we get started? Hi everyone, welcome to the SLSA General Community Meeting. As a reminder, if you could record your attendance in the meeting notes, which also has a convenience alias, salsadev/notes/community. There's an attendee list right there. Also, I see other folks filling in the SIG updates. Thank you very much for that. First, I want to welcome any new members, and if you want to quickly say hi, that would be great. You're welcome to do so. Looks like actually I think I recognize everyone here. Okay, we could jump straight into SIG updates. On the specification side, there hasn't been a ton of activity. There's some mostly minor things. The GitHub, we submitted a new GitHub pull request convention that should hopefully make our Git history easier to follow. You could view it at that pull request that's linked in the meeting notes, number 890. The gist is that we have a convention in the pull request title to say whether it's a content change or a editorial change or something that's not to do with the specification, to make it easier to kind of follow along, like which ones are important and which ones are not, and update the convention around how many reviews are required and how long it takes, and like how long the waiting period to make sure we have kind of lazy consensus. And so that will hopefully make the project run a little bit more smoothly. We switched hosting of the website to Netlify. That should be a no-up, but if you see any website issues, let me know. In the spec meetings, we've had, I think there's been one or two small kind of editorial pull requests that have been submitted. And we've had various discussions about clarity to the spec, feedback on 1.0. And we kind of have a queue of things to work on, but I think nothing major that's worth bringing up here unless anyone wants to chime in. We had one, I didn't put it in the meeting notes, we had one question around the discrepancy between the in toto protocol buffer schema and the SLSA, like our copy, because there's two different versions, but that's been resolved on the in toto side. So in case you happen to see that, that's being resolved. And because there's some ambiguity in the spec, because we effectively list the schema twice in two different languages, and if they are in conflict, I think there's an open pull request that defines which one's authoritative in the event of a conflict. And then the last one is the VSA. This is probably the most meaningful one. Format. There's a pull request to update it in a couple different ways, making a couple fields optional, clarifying the meaning of it, etc. And so if you use VSA or have opinions on that, your feedback would be most welcome.
So Mark,
Yeah, Arne?
Sorry, I had a quick question. I mean, the pull request VSA 1.1. I'm a bit confused. Didn't we decide to keep the same number as the salsa spec, or?
Yeah, I just used the title. Let me just change it here.
Okay.
You know what? Let me just comment on that pull request. That title really shouldn't be that. I think it was because we had decided back in the spec meeting, we had thought about doing a 1.1 release to
Right.
fix the other thing, the in
Yeah,
toto
the
thing.
discrepancy within total.
Right, but now that that's not needed, I think we probably won't. I think we need to figure out before that's submitted what we do, like if we make a 1.1 release or not. Let me just add to do. This. Okay, I quickly commented. Yeah, and we should update the pull request title to the match. Yeah, it was not, I think the pull request was not intended to say that we're doing a 1.1 release. It was not, I think, intended to make that decision, but we do need to make that decision, what we're going to do.
All right, thanks.
BSA. I think that's it from the spec side. So is it Trishang?
Oh, anything with positioning and tooling? I just want to make sure.
Oh yeah. In terms of the question, you said the 1.0 PR clarify with respect to the previous discrepancy in total. No, I think the previous discrepancy was just. I think it was just in the provenance, not in the SA format.
Okay, good then. Thanks.
I think. You know, that's a good point, and I'll double check though. Positioning.
So we've been brainstorming on potential next steps for not only SLSA, but S2C2S, and potentially Guac going forward, if it gets approved, of trying to do micro videos and embedding training modules into the LF existing content. And so I'm working with Jennifer Bly. I have a meeting later today to ask what kind of help they can provide for the micro videos, since none of us have video editing capabilities, at least on the call for positioning. We have the content that we want to talk about. It's just how do you get it to a larger audience? And in terms of the training modules, I do have the contact now for the training modules, so I'll start reaching out so that we can have not only SLSA training modules, but for S2C2, I think S2C2F already has, but potentially Guac or Fresca, et cetera. Anything supply chain integrity related, we're going to try to work with them. That's it.
Tooling.
Yeah, so on the tooling side, we canceled the meeting. There didn't seem to be a lot of interest to keep participating, at least at this time. And I think it's mostly focused around the actual building of the tools. We got a lot of folks who seemed interested in better understanding how to consume tools, but without those tools currently existing, yeah, I think there seems to be, not really a whole lot of interest there. So cancel the meeting. But with that said, I think that there's a couple of things that are worth at least highlighting. One is that there's a lot of interest in obviously consuming tools, but not so much in the building of SLSA tools. So a lot of folks are like, hey, how do I, I have Jenkins, how do I use SLSA? What do I start doing? And on that end, but as far as, creating, let's say, plugins or best practices or things on that end, there didn't seem to be a lot of interest in participating there. We switched to being more, async. So if folks have things, they could definitely post in the chat. There is also, interest at least in highlighting where there, what tools hit what things in Salsa. So for example, here's like Salsa production tools, here's Salsa consumption tools, and maybe other associated sets of things. So there's some interest there, but I think at this point, gonna put most of the tooling stuff on the back burner, at least in the open source space. I know there seem to be a lot of folks who are interested in the Salsa side, but they want to keep that closed source and build their own sort of stuff that they can sell. Myself, I am actually also working on a bit of like a Salsa API, something to, one of the big things that's coming out of like the Salsa, the Sterling toolchain from the OpenSSF side is some of the stuff that was discussed is stuff like building kind of a control plane or building a set of APIs for different pieces of the supply chain. And one of the things is, hey, if Salsa is in the build side, and you might imagine that one of the, let's say the build, the output, like the input might be source code dependencies, and the output would be a Salsa attestation. And the idea should be, okay, as we build out the Salsa tool, the Sterling toolchain or whatever it ends up being called, things that are downstream would then consume Salsa at some level. And so there's some, discussion and work happening on that end.
Great, thanks. Any questions on any of the SIG updates or any other comments?
My only sort of meta comment is on the tooling. Like, I wonder how much. I know there are some people implementing Salsa, and I wonder if we should be trying to reach out to other projects that we think should implement Salsa. But that's it's a pretty big ask doing that kind of outreach. I'd love to hear how useful the current spec is for the people doing that work, though. And that would be a good way to try and get some more feedback on it.
Yeah, so there is some work that's happening outside of OpenSSF. So OSTIF is doing some of this, as well as the CNCF, on sort of doing audits of Salsa and trying to at least highlight where people might want to start using it. I know that largely most of the LF groups have, and including the projects within LF, have a lot of latitude in what they do or don't do. So as far as and I think a lot of it comes down to incentives. So right now, a lot of projects don't have a lot of incentives to do Salsa, because once again, when you're talking about open source, unless, it's asking a lot of volunteers often to go into extra work is not super helpful. And then even I think among this group, outside of a couple of companies obviously that are quite large that can, let's say, volunteer, have employees volunteer where they are still getting paid for their work. There's a lot of there's not like a lot of interest, because when speaking to some of these groups, one of the things they said, hey, I have, here's my list of things I need to get done for this project, and adding Salsa on there is a whole bunch of stuff. And for the most part, even though in I think walking them through and seeing, hey, it's only just a handful of things, it's actually not that bad. It's just, I think folks are looking for, hey, if you gave me a resource to just help me implement this for a day, it would be more than enough.
Yeah, I think, well, so where we ended up with Salsa 1 was effectively that for teams producing software, Salsa adherence is mostly about choosing the right platform. But so the tooling meeting makes most sense as a discussion forum for people building the platforms, and that's who we are seeing a lot of participation from.
So there's two things I think on that front. One thing that I noticed was a couple of the groups, well, I won't say because it seemed to be, I don't want to say completely in confidence, but it seemed like a couple of companies were like, we're building a closed source salsa builder. And that's kind of going to be our thing. We're going to announce it at some point. And so there seemed to be interest on that front. And then there was other folks who were interested in saying, hey, I use Jenkins. How do I prove that my Jenkins could be salsa conformant? What are the practices and so on and so forth? And I think that there is interest there, but as far as a contribution standpoint, there didn't seem to be a lot of interest. There seemed to be a lot of interest in, hey, this is a thing I want because I don't want to switch off of Jenkins, but I also don't have the time, money, resources, et cetera, to actually either, build a best practices guide for, applying salsa to Jenkins or building tools to make salsa, compliant with Jenkins, Jenkins compliant with salsa or conformant with salsa.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I do wonder if we'll see interest as we continue to build out the notion of a conformance program.
Yeah, and I think
go ahead.
Yeah, I think on that end, also to kind of go back to your first point of it's mostly about choosing the right platform. I agree, but even among the folks who are using GitHub, I think a lot of folks are either not aware of the salsa builders, the ones that for GitHub, and in addition to that, I think even the folks who do know, like they just need a day of like, hey, I'll spend 2 hours with somebody to just walk me through this, because as it turns out, my build just needs to be rewired a little bit, but I just don't have the time to sit down. And even if it ends up being, 10 lines of yabble that get changed, it's about, but am I missing something? Am I breaking something else? It's like all of those trade-offs get taken, which is actually one of the things that OSTIF is looking to do. And it's actually something that we're working with, my company, Kusari, is working with OSTIF on, is like, hey, helping do those sorts of things, because
right.
We all have a million things to do throughout the day. And even if it's like, oh, it's only a day's worth of work just to kind of refactor all this stuff to get it up and running, and then to maintain it, it's trivial, but it's like getting that, given that a lot of these folks, don't have the time, it's just yeah. But with that said, I think, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think one thing you said was kind of like indicative, which is that I need to find half a day to sit down with someone. But if you need to sit down with someone to understand the tool and adopt it, then there's obviously a problem there. Like it should, yes, you need to find the time to do it, but it shouldn't require, in an ideal world, it wouldn't require any more than the time and like the tooling's documentation, right? So I think it would be, really, I wonder if we could have like a task force almost within the tooling team, and it sounds like to a certain extent Kusari is doing some of this, to just go to some projects, do this integration and feed that back into like documentation and possibly like for want of a better term, UX improvements to the tool itself.
Yeah. So on that end, I don't want to pre-announce too much because we do plan to open source it. But one of the things
it's not like this is recorded.
Yeah, I know. We are building out using an open API specification for almost like a salsa API, where the idea would be for like, if you imagine, and it's more of like a salsa builder API. So the idea would be the actual builds could happen anywhere, GitHub, Jenkins, whatever, it doesn't matter. But the idea is the API itself is the thing that calls the actual builder. And that the idea, it would also be that API is the trusted control plane, because you are sort of running, so the idea is it's not necessarily a full-blown CI/CD. And then, and so this would be for stuff that's maybe not so much SaaS side, but you can imagine, hey, I'm running, I don't know, I'm running, go build. Great. Well, this thing has a very specific thing that it runs go build, or it uses an in toto layout, or however you want to kind of have that set up. But the basic idea is the inputs SLSA expects, and the outputs are SLSA. And so everything else is sort of an implementation detail, as long as it meets the SLSA conformance requirements for the implementation. But I think for the end user, all of a sudden that becomes significantly more easy, because you're sort of just saying, hey, as long as anything hits this API, great, here's the selection of things. And as long as anything conforms to that, right? And that could even be a GitHub builder that conforms to that API, right? And it makes it very easy using open API stuff of just saying the inputs are going to be this JSON schema and the outputs are going to be this JSON schema, and everything else just gets handled by the actual implementation. So that's something that I'm hoping in the next couple of weeks, couple of months to be releasing, you know, and open sourcing there. But yeah, I think the other things just generally are, you know, I think one of the things that I've been talking to OpenSSF about as well is it might make sense to do something like, here is a SLSA implementation guide, and it's a case study based on an actual, like, yeah, we worked with this team and we did A, B, C, and D, and this is SLSA. And it could be just a simple case, right, of here's the SLSA builder that's baked into this one. And in fact, that is something that I know OpenSSF is looking at to actually do a case study with some folks on that. And in fact, I believe OpenSSF is willing to throw some money to help that make that happen, because I know for, you know, or at least, you know, for certain companies where it's more the publicity, that's the big thing, you know, help work with folks.
So for that case study, are you thinking of like working with a platform effectively, like an open source CI/CD platform or something, and helping them to implement SLSA in the platform, or is you thinking from the sort of end user producer perspective?
So it's more on right now the latter, but I believe the former is something else that's also being discussed, because I think at least right now, this latter piece, it's about, for the at least the OpenSSF, has been about how do you drive more end users to come in. Oh, okay, well, let's build some end user guides so that folks better understand how to actually adopt what OpenSSF is building out. And then with that said, though, I think that it's probably worthwhile to do the other one as well. Though I think there's going to be a lot of push on how do you do that with, it probably wouldn't be with a vendor. It'd probably be, hey, here's an open source tool and here's how we SLSAified it, as opposed to here is, you know, CI/CD vendor X, their, you know, platform for doing it.
Sure, yeah, but there are quite a few open source tools that you could do that work with, right, and provide that kind of story of what changes were required and what changes you made to get to that point, which I think would be really useful. But yeah, cool. Thanks for the discussion. I don't want to take any more time unless anyone else has anything they want to add. Sounds like not. Then I think we're on to the next topic, which is Trishank providing an update on the steering committee.
Yep. Hello. Hi, everyone. So I took the opportunity to use the long weekend to come up with some thoughts on what we think we should do next. So let me share my screen. Oh, never mind. Students, it's not easy to. Never mind. So, but basically, if you follow the notes, what basically happened, someone correct me if I'm summarizing it wrongly, is that Bruno helped us to figure out what the election process should look like for the next steering committee, right? Because it's about time. And out of that fell out some higher level questions, such as there were questions at the last meeting about, should the steering committee be more transparent, or should members be more active? And there was even a higher meta level question, which is, do we even need a steering committee? So I took the chance to, and I really would like to share screen now, but I'm not sure why Zoom is not cooperating. So sorry about that. Give me a really shouldn't be using macOS Stage Manager. Put a warning for people who are using. Okay, let's see. Okay, there we go. I think we have it. Great. Okay. So I took the chance to, and here's Bruno's elections document, by the way. You can find links to both documents in the meeting notes. So these are just my thoughts. I'm not saying that this is what everyone should be agreeing to, although I think it gives us a place to start from. Documented what the problems were, who the current steering committee is, and what the next steering committee should be doing. Some high-level thoughts of mine, and I'd love to hear discussion from everyone. But by the way, I need help from one of the steering committee members to make a copy of this document, because I unfortunately can't make this public. So if anyone who has power can do that, please make a copy of this, make it public, and share it with the rest of the community, please. So anyway, what I want to make a little argument about today is why we need a steering committee. One thing that I found missing is that we don't have an explicit charter. So if you go to our governance doc right now, it talks about what the steering committee members are supposed to do, but in way of example. So it's not really clear whether we're missing anything here, whether there are minimum requirements. In my view, a steering committee should do important things, like one of the things that we do in other communities, such as in Toto, which I'm going to use as a large example here. We use the steering committee as one of the things is to define a roadmap, for example. So things like, what are we going to do next for SLSA 2.0? Conformance program, testing policies, build security level 4, or do we focus on source security? There are all these questions to answer for which I think we need a steering committee. And of course, there are basic things like conflict resolution, which we hope doesn't happen too often, but I think that's also an important function. And of course, whatever the next steering committee does, it does need to address questions, feedback from the community, such as being sufficiently active. What does that mean? We need to show more transparency. Even if we're meeting once a month, we need to maybe make the meeting public, take public notes at least, and all that sort of stuff. And I've also added some other values that I think we need: neutrality, fiduciary responsibility, for the lack of a better term. In other words, trying to make sure you're doing the best for the community as opposed to just whoever you happen to represent. And so I have this document here. I highly encourage the current committee as well as the community to take a look at it. I've included things like the mission and the charter. And as part of all of this, we need to use Bruno's excellent work on trying to nail down the election process too. There are some specifics now that I think we don't need to get too hung up about. I copied it from Intoto, so accidentally reduced the number from 7 to 5. That was not intentional. This was just copying someone else's good work. And so we should talk about all of this. One thing that I personally like to see, that I like to end with, the next committee, this leads very nicely to a point Joshua, and I think even Michael raised earlier, which is that perhaps the next steering committee should actively represent, say, build platform builders, without going into names necessarily, and should be an active representation of both the industry and open source, in my opinion. Something that we haven't really considered, in my opinion, is how build platforms, proprietary, well, not entirely proprietary, but self-hosted build platforms, such as those used by, say, distros such as Debian, how they would be able to use SLSA. Anyway, I stop here. I hope this makes sense. And I see a few questions in the chat. Let's see. The SC needs to, yes, Arno. Arno's right. Yes, a lot of the feedback here that we saw the last time. Yes, it does need to be more transparent. That is not an option. I agree. Melba said that we have a roadmap we started earlier this year. Very good. Then we should just either finalize it or expand on it and then go from there. Questions, please, and discussion, more importantly.
I like this. I just need time to read through it since I didn't have access till a few minutes ago.
Yeah, so likewise, I mean, I haven't really seen the document, but I will look into it. Thank you for trying to document this. This is a huge step forward, obviously. I mean, I still, I haven't read it, so I shouldn't come up further maybe, but, you said something like, oh, to do a roadmap, we need an SC. To me, that's a false logic, because you could say, no, we have this group, for instance, we could say, hey, we could use this group to define the roadmap with some kind of, trying to be more collegial. And that's why I'm like, I did say it was being provocative of me to say, hey, do we even need an SC? Because I'm not trying to kill it necessarily, but I think it has to be clearly defined what the value is. So I will read it, and I reserve my final opinion on that.
Yeah, the roadmap one. I mean, it was me, Aaron, and I can't remember who else that created the roadmap, and we presented to this broader community, and we said, does it make sense? Right. And we did agree on what we should do in terms of not defining timelines, because we're always missing them, right? Just high level, this is what's now, but this is what's later. So we don't necessarily need a steering committee but for a roadmap. But I do think the steering committee should own the roadmap, right? Because ultimately they're the ones that are trying to steer SLSA in a certain direction. But I don't necessarily think they need to be the sole owners of the roadmap, right? Because we've already done that without the steering committee.
Sure, yeah, let me try to clarify that, what I meant to. Yeah, but excellent point. I guess I should clarify. So what I mean is, yes, even if the roadmap is not entirely defined, perhaps not even largely defined by the steering committee at all, as you said, I still think it's important to try to have a group that, like I said earlier, the values such as being neutral and the fiduciary responsibility, for the lack of a better term, if that makes any sense, to try to make sure that we capture the community's interests. But again, maybe steering committee is not the maybe too what do you call, too burdensome an option. So that's something. So here's what I recommend, right? I think it's very important for the steering committee, the current steering committee, before the next monthly meeting, to read this document, comment on it, and we should have another meeting where we should record it for sure, document it for public consumption, and talk about where we're gonna go next with this, and present what we concretely plan to do for the next meeting.
I think maybe to the point about like who does it, perhaps it's correct to say that the steering committee is like in a racy sense, responsible, accountable, something informed. Someone could remember what the C is. The steering committee is accountable for the roadmap, but is not necessarily the one responsible for actually doing it. Oh, consulted. And so I think there could be multiple people responsible or consulted, but I think ultimately it's the steering committee who's accountable for that. Does that resonate, or does that help resolve the conflict?
Arna?
So yeah, I do think this helps in defining the responsibility basically of the SC, right? And so, but I think in that line of thought, actually, the transparency I don't think is argued by anybody. We need to have more transparency, and in fact, I think part of the reason that some of us say, do we even need an SC, is because there is currently no transparency. So I highly recommend that you start being more transparent right now, and so that people can appreciate what's being done by the SC. Then the people are not going to question, why do we need one in the first place? And you know, last time I raised that question, I was told, well, that's because we haven't really been doing much. And then it just reinforces this feeling that, well, then why do we even need one if you guys aren't really doing anything anyway? So it's a bit of vicious cycle that I think you need to try to break by being more transparent and show what the value is.
Yeah, I think I agree with Arno on that. I think that if we take a step back, you know, we haven't had any sort of official meetings, and more or less the steering committee was more or less used as it previously as a sort of, hey, here are members of the community who've been more like, they were actually more like maintainers than necessarily purely steering committee members, and it was more of like, hey, this doesn't sound like what we want to do with salsa, you know, like this seems like out of the scope of what we had already decided on, and kind of helping push things back in that direction. But yeah, I think, like, I don't know if we necessarily need that versus just purely a maintainer track. Outside of something like, you know, having maintainers on this. With that said, I could still see the argument that having a steering committee is valuable, especially as time is going on, like, you know, and we start to look at, start trying to build stuff like the roadmap and say like, hey, this sort of thing doesn't seem like what we probably want to do with salsa because it's just not the right time or whatever. I think, but I think to your point, Arno, yeah, we definitely need to come to that conclusion. And it's not necessarily a lack of transparency. It's almost like there's not really been a lot going on with it.
I think
Hey,
Jay
can you
has a
guys hear me?
question. There we go. Yeah, we can.
Okay, yeah, I got to dial in with my phone today. For some reason, I'm having issues with sound on the box here. So, steering committees. We have a whole working group that sits above this SIG, right? That's where your steering committee should live. Steering committees drive strategy. They don't drive roadmaps, they drive strategy. The roadmap is driven inside of the SIG that reports that roadmap up to the steering committee to see if it jives with the strategy. That being the case, I would say that you would have a steering committee at the working group level that governs all of the work being done, framework-wise or whatever, across the entire working group. And then you would have subcommittees for each respective framework, and then each SIG would develop their own roadmaps that reports into those subcommittees, that reports into the larger steering committee that should be steering strategy across the entire working group with respect to frameworks and tools that are being developed for the purpose of consumption of end users outside of that environment. This is just a hierarchical structure that could be developed that would take a lot of the additional thought out of the way and provide that racy environment that Mark was talking about earlier, right? You could develop a solid racy structure based on that you could then say who's responsible for what, who's accountable for the entire situation, who should be consulted, and then who should be informed. That makes that linear, right? That makes that well understood, well defined, and linear when you don't just try to bring a steering committee down into a group. And what I hear with respect to a steering committee, and what I hear about the yeses or nos is wrapped around, well, how can you form a steering committee inside of a SIG that's been going, I'm not going to say aimlessly, but that has been going with a strategy, that has been going with a perceived roadmap based on a perceived strategy, and then you're going to form a steering committee out of all of that. For what purpose now? That should be tossed up a little higher so that it could be formed and defined in such a way that can now provide governance down to the SIG, rather than the SIG trying to govern itself, hence how we got here, having this conversation now versus when Melba and Aaron this time last year was trying to provide a roadmap against a, dare I say, a non-strategy. The strategy wasn't even formed then, but Melba and Aaron is trying to form a roadmap against what? You form a roadmap against the strategy, not the other way around.
I think that's very good feedback. Thanks. Joshua, please.
Yeah, I think I just felt the need to point out that historically the steering committee predates like some of the structure in the OpenSSF. So we should consider whether the steering committee makes sense within the current and established structure of the OpenSSF. Yeah, we're not trying to form a steering committee now, like in contention with that structure. We have a steering committee that has been super useful at times. Fortunately, hasn't had to do a lot of what does exist within its roles and responsibilities. And I think one of the responsibilities we imagined of the steering committee was reviewing, like providing the strategic oversight and reviewing the roadmap, but we haven't had a new roadmap for a while because we've been focused on the last one until quite recently. So I thought that kind of historical context was at least worth raising. But yeah, I think there is a valid point that we should consider how we align with the rest of the OpenSSF structure. I'm a little bit reluctant. I want to raise the point that this is an open source project and it's largely volunteer driven. So like the racing structure and accountability and things are a little bit more squishy than normal. We can't actually, for the most part, we can't really hold people accountable for deliverables and whatnot because they are volunteering their time, right? So we need to be aware of that when we are thinking about how to structure this and proposing any structure. Yeah.
Well, to a point, I mean, Josh, because if this is an election, if this is elected roles, people volunteer, they commit to some role. So at that point, you can hold them responsible for doing the work they ran for.
Yes, I do agree with that. Yeah, the full structure, I don't like the full notion of ratio. I don't think fits within open source.
Oh,
but
I agree with that.
Yeah, if someone has volunteered to do something, it's reasonable to hold them accountable to that. Don't disagree with that statement.
Any other questions or feedback?
So this is, I think, a little, because I think this is actually highlighting a separate problem just purely than the steering committee, which is more around post 1.0. And this is, I just want to say, this is slightly tangential, but it's probably something we just might want to tag as like a topic for a future meeting to really dive into, which is the post 1.0. We don't really have a roadmap. We still haven't really decided on what we're really focused on next. There's a couple of things, obviously, that we're still, that's still being done, like the conformance stuff, and some folks are still working on some tools. But I think it is probably worthwhile for us to maybe go back and do a deep dive here on SLSA, just to kind of go back and say, hey, what is the thing that that SLSA is going to be focused on next? What is the thing that the community has decided on, and so on? Because I think a lot of these points are a little moot when as far as what is SLSA working on in the future, or even just from a general community consensus hasn't been built yet. Sorry, Melba.
Yeah, so I want to show this to everyone because I feel like people have forgotten. right? Because we all talked about this on what we're working on now versus what's coming up next. Obviously, we should revisit this as we progress. But this is what we decided, I don't know, maybe April-ish timeframe of what we were going to work on now, right? Post 1.0 versus what's coming up next was, if we get to it, we get to it, but it's not going to be a priority. But this is what we decided as a group. I believe it was actually in one of these meetings, in the biweekly meetings, that this is what we were going to do now. So if this has changed, that's okay, but we should try to use this roadmap and update it as much as we can. But we have talked about this year during 1.0, and this was the consensus, because before it was, I don't have the original slide. Before I had quarters and everything, and we were like, no timelines. So I think this was per the strategy of supply chain integrity, right? They have a charter and they were working towards a charter, and we said, okay, if we go towards that charter and that strategy, then this seems to align. But yeah, so I just want to remind folks that this is here. People can edit it, I think. If you can't, let me know. But we definitely need to revisit this now that 1.0 is done, and if something needs to be added or removed.
So I agree, Melba. I think and I misstated what I meant, which was the thing about the roadmap that kind of has come out of it is, as far as I can tell, none of these things have actually been started. Outside of obviously the stuff that's currently working, right? So like some of the verification stuff and some of the other things and some of the tools, it's been brought up, for example, in some of the tooling meetings, but nobody has taken on sort of the ownership of that stuff. And I think it goes back to that first problem of we're all volunteers here, and a lot of folks are not necessarily, don't have the time to focus on some of these things, right? Like there's the day-to-day stuff of like, hey, people are pointing out a couple of inconsistencies here and there in the specification, or things that need to be clarified, editorial, yada, yada. But as far as something like, outside of, I think, one of the questions being like that hermetic reproducible thing for a new SLSA build level 4, not a lot of these things haven't kind of gone anywhere outside of some initial discussions.
Mark?
Yeah, I just want to maybe echo Jay's comments. I think Jay brought up a really good point, which is that we are missing like a different organizations use different structure, but some sort of like mission, vision, strategy, or mission, vision, goals, or some sort of pyramid type of thing. And we've been talking about like the roadmap and maybe the strategy, but without talking about the higher part of the pyramid, which is an agreed upon. I'm not even sure if we can, how it really works in an open source organization like this, but like a mission, like a framework that we've used in our team, which is, I think, pretty successful, is like a mission statement, which is like a one sentence, a very short one sentence thing. And you could look them up online. Various companies have ones. And some sort of like clear vision for what we want it to look like in the future. And I think I've heard feedback from a lot of people that like the vision is unclear to many people. Like even within our, I think we maybe in our heads have an idea of what the vision looks like, but we haven't agreed upon it. But certainly to anyone outside of people like in this meeting, they don't really know where SLSA goes, and they don't kind of have a picture for like what we want SLSA to become. And so agreeing on that, which is much higher level, much more abstract, maybe, like ideally a couple paragraphs or something, maybe a picture, I think is really valuable. And then once we have that, and to Jay's point, then we could work, it'll be easier for us to work toward that, and we could talk about, well, what are the strategies we want to use to get there? what are the kind of the intermediate goals. And I think that really is would be pretty valuable. I think Trishank was first.
Arno, why don't you go ahead and then I'll finish.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be quick because I just wanted to highlight that Omkar, who is the new general manager for OpenSSF and who comes from Google, is pushing for that very approach across the board. So you're not far, Mark, with this idea.
Marcella?
Yeah, on the roadmap topic as well. I mean, knowing what we know from the 1.0 process, right, which took much longer. I mean, that roadmap has a lot of things on it. And so being able to not just say, here are the things you would like to do, but here's the priority, I think is something that we could probably work on. But I don't know if this is a steering committee responsibility, if this is a community responsibility, but having like 4 really high level things where if we can't even decide what we want to do first, right, it'll be really difficult to make progress. So that was just my comment.
Thank you for feedback, everyone. It's like 5 minutes left. I want to make sure we end well. Here's what I propose, and the steering committee, current steering, feel free to push back, but I think we should meet sooner than later. I think we should read this document as soon as possible. And then I propose meet as early as next week so that by the time the next monthly meeting comes along, we have a much better picture and a story to tell the community about where we think things should go next and have some concrete solution. What does everyone think? Michael.
Yeah, so that sounds good. And I think also along those lines is, I don't want to go the full-blown racy thing again, but I do think that it's probably worthwhile to even just sort of say, maintainer, steering committee member, whatever you want to call it, but one of the folks who is been core, in the community on some of these things, just saying that they are sort of responsible from the standpoint of just keeping folks up to date on what the status is, even if the status is nobody seems interested or there hasn't been a lot of work on it. Not necessarily saying that they're doing the work, just sort of driving the conversation, I think is also worthwhile. Because when I look at a lot of the different things on the roadmap, one of the things that kind of comes to mind is, hey, who is, let's say, the one who is just saying, yep, I talked to the community about doing this thing and we couldn't find folks. Because even that I think is helpful rather than just, we don't know. So I think that would be helpful, as well as just to kind of say, hey, who's going to lead up at least the conversation on, so for Chris is doing conformance and some of the other folks are doing some of the other things. But let's say I could take like the tooling pieces and say, hey, I reached out to these folks about verification tools and there's some folks working on it, or I don't have resources. So if we got some resources, we'd be able to work on it. But I think even that's better than just kind of where we're currently at, which is just, it's kind of communication silence on it.
No, I agree. And if the current steering committee members who are here don't have any objections, I will send a doodle and we will take it from there. Thank you, Arno. Mark, do you have any parting thoughts?
No, none in particular. I think this is great. I think actually just reading the OpenSSF supply chain charter, we need to figure out like where does SLSA end and other things begin, because actually this is probably goes a long way to what we're talking about in this meeting. I don't know if other folks have read this. I'd not seen this document before here, and so I think that helps a lot. But thanks, Trishank, for getting this going. I look forward to like kind of resolving this and making the org work more effectively.
Cool.
Anything else?
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks everyone. See you soon.